Officer Sarah Mitchell arrived at the Denver District Courthouse on a cold Tuesday morning in March, the kind of day where the winter chill still lingered despite spring's approach. She wore her full police uniform, pressed and professional, every detail immaculate as always. Beside her walked Duke, her 4-year-old German Shepherd partner, his sleek coat gleaming under the fluorescent courthouse lights. Duke's collar bore badges of honor from his years of service, a K-9 unit veteran with an exemplary record and an unwavering loyalty that Sarah cherished deeply. Together, they'd navigated countless situations, from criminal investigations to community events, but courtroom testimony always felt different. This wasn't about catching criminals or preventing crime. This was about people's lives, families torn apart, futures hanging in the balance. The courthouse corridors echoed with their footsteps, the sharp click of Sarah's boots against polished marble floors, the softer padding of Duke's paws. They passed other attorneys in dark suits, social workers carrying thick case files, and security personnel manning metal detectors. Sarah had received a subpoena weeks earlier, requiring her to testify about a domestic incident she'd witnessed 6 months ago. The case involved a custody dispute over 3-year-old Emma Richardson, a child caught in the middle of her parents' fractured relationship. Sarah didn't know the details of the case intimately, only that her testimony regarding what she'd observed could be crucial to determining the child's future living situation. The weight of that responsibility settled heavily on her shoulders as she entered the courtroom itself. Judge Patricia Henderson was already seated at the elevated bench, reviewing court documents with the focused intensity that defined her judicial career. Judge Henderson had been presiding over family law cases in Denver for nearly 2 decades, and she'd earned a reputation for being firm but fair, stern but thorough. She didn't tolerate nonsense or emotional manipulation in her courtroom. She dealt in facts, evidence, and what the law dictated. Yet beneath that rigid exterior, those who knew her recognized a judge deeply invested in protecting vulnerable populations, particularly children. Her office walls displayed photographs of legal precedents she'd set, cases that had changed how family law operated in Colorado. She looked up briefly as Sarah and Duke entered, acknowledging them with a slight nod before returning to her documents. The courtroom itself was intimidating by design, high ceilings soaring overhead, imposing wooden furniture, the judge's bench positioned above everyone else like a throne of justice. The gallery was separated from the legal proceedings by a wooden railing, and on the other side of that barrier sat little Emma Richardson, gripping her grandmother's hand with the desperate intensity of a child sensing that something monumentally important was happening around her, even if she couldn't fully comprehend it. Emma was small for 3 years old, her blonde curls framing a face marked by confusion and worry that no child should have to carry. She wore a pink dress, carefully chosen by her grandmother Margaret to make her look presentable, to help her pass the unspoken tests of worthiness that seemed to pervade custody proceedings. Margaret sat beside her granddaughter, her own face etched with the exhaustion of someone who'd been fighting a battle they never signed up for. Margaret Richardson was in her mid-60s, a retired schoolteacher who'd stepped into the role of primary caregiver when Emma's parents' marriage imploded. She loved her granddaughter fiercely, protectively, with the fierce devotion of someone who'd already raised children and was now tasked with raising a grandchild through trauma. Also present in the courtroom were attorneys representing both parents, their legal arguments prepared and rehearsed. Emma's mother, though subpoenaed, had not appeared, a detail that hung in the courtroom air like an accusation. Her father sat with his attorney, shifting uncomfortably in his seat, his expensive suit and carefully groomed appearance suggesting he was trying to project stability and respectability to the judge. A court-appointed advocate for the child sat nearby, her role to represent Emma's interests independently of either parent. Court reporters prepared their recording equipment. A bailiff stood near the door. Everything was positioned. Everything was ready for the machinery of justice to operate. Sarah guided Duke to the designated area where she would sit during her testimony. Duke had been trained extensively for courtroom appearances. He was accustomed to sitting calmly, remaining quiet and unobtrusive, not drawing attention from the legal proceedings. His presence was meant to be stabilizing for Sarah, a comfort during the stress of public testimony, but not a distraction. Sarah settled into her seat and Duke immediately assumed his trained position on the floor beside her, his body alert but relaxed, his eyes forward. She reached down to briefly touch his head, drawing comfort from his familiar presence. Duke's warmth, his solid reality, grounded her. In just moments she would take the oath, place her hand on the Bible, and swear to tell the truth about what she'd witnessed months earlier. Judge Henderson reviewed the case file once more, her eyes scanning the details with practiced speed. Custody disputes were common. She'd overseen hundreds of them. But each one involved a child's future, and that weight never diminished, no matter how many years she'd served. She glanced again at little Emma in the gallery, observing the child with the kind of clinical assessment that years of experience provided. The child appeared anxious, Margaret appeared exhausted, and the entire situation radiated the kind of human suffering that the legal system was designed to address, even if the law couldn't heal broken hearts. The judge called the court to order. The bailiff announced the case number and the parties involved. Everyone stood as protocol demanded. Sarah felt her heart rate increase slightly, that pre-testimony adrenaline surge. Duke remained calm, his presence steady. Margaret pulled Emma closer, her protective grandmother instincts moving into higher gear. Emma's father straightened his tie. The court reporters positioned their fingers over their equipment, ready to capture every word spoken. Judge Henderson looked directly at Officer Sarah Mitchell and nodded, indicating that she was ready to proceed. Sarah rose to approach the witness stand, Duke remaining in his position, trained to stay put. As she was sworn in, her hand on the Bible, Sarah made her promise to tell the truth. The clerk asked her name, her occupation, her years of service. Sarah answered each question clearly and professionally. Then Judge Henderson began her questioning, and Sarah began to recount the incident from 6 months ago, the call she'd responded to, what she'd observed, the behavior she'd witnessed that had been relevant to the case. It was at this precise moment, just as Sarah was beginning her testimony, that little Emma in the gallery began to shift uncomfortably. The stress of the courtroom, the formality, the awareness that her future was being decided in this room, it all began to manifest in her small body. Margaret held her granddaughter's hand tighter, trying to provide reassurance, trying to communicate through touch that everything would be okay. But even Margaret couldn't have anticipated what was about to unfold, how a moment of crisis would transform into something extraordinary, how a dog would reach across the boundaries of training and protocol to change everything. As Officer Sarah Mitchell continued her testimony, her voice steady and professional, describing the specific details of the domestic incident from 6 months prior, something shifted in the gallery. Little Emma Richardson, who had been sitting relatively quietly beside her grandmother, began to fidget. It started subtly, her small legs swinging back and forth beneath the wooden bench, her fingers releasing Margaret's hand briefly before gripping it again, harder this time. Margaret noticed immediately, as grandmothers do, that particular awareness of a child's emotional state that transcends words. She leaned down slightly, placing a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder, whispering soft reassurances in her ear. "It's okay, sweetheart," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. "We're almost done. You're doing so well." But Emma didn't respond to the reassurance the way she normally would. Instead, her small body remained tense, her breathing becoming slightly more rapid. Margaret recognized the signs because she'd seen them countless times over the past 6 months, the beginning of what she'd come to understand as Emma's trauma responses. The child had been through so much already. She'd endured her parents' separation, multiple interviews with social workers and therapists, the uncertainty of custody arrangements, and the fear that comes from a 3-year-old's incomplete understanding that her world had fundamentally changed. Now, sitting in this formal courtroom with its intimidating atmosphere, its raised voices, its air of judgment and consequence. Emma's nervous system was beginning to overload. Sarah continued testifying, unaware of Emma's escalating distress. She was focused on the judge's questions, on articulating her observations clearly and completely, on fulfilling her civic duty. Judge Henderson listened intently, making notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. The attorneys took notes as well, preparing potential cross-examinations. The court reporter's fingers flew across the keyboard, capturing every word. The courtroom operated on its established rhythm, the machinery of justice grinding steadily forward. But in the gallery, Emma's anxiety was building like a storm approaching on the horizon. The child's breath came faster. Her small fingers twisted anxiously in her grandmother's sleeve, the fabric wrinkling beneath her desperate grip. A soft whimper escaped her throat, barely audible but present. Margaret immediately felt the shift intensify. She knew this sound, this particular quality of distress. It was the precursor to a full emotional breakdown. "Sweetheart, honey, it's okay," Margaret whispered again, pulling Emma closer, trying to physically shield her granddaughter from whatever internal terror was overwhelming her small mind. But Emma wasn't responding to maternal comfort the way she normally did. Her body remained rigid. Her breathing remained shallow and rapid. A tiny tear formed at the corner of her eye. Margaret's mind raced through the options. She could try taking Emma out to the hallway, but the judge had instructed that Emma needed to remain present in the courtroom. Her presence, while silent, was part of the testimony. The judge wanted to observe the child, wanted to assess her demeanor. Margaret couldn't simply leave without drawing attention or risking the judge's disapproval. She was trapped in an impossible situation, trying to comfort a traumatized child in an environment specifically designed to be formal, intimidating, and emotionally complex. Emma's whimper grew slightly louder. Judge Henderson glanced in the child's direction, her stern expression showing the first signs of irritation. Officer Sarah paused mid-sentence, also noticing the disruption. The attorneys turned in their seats. The entire courtroom's attention began to shift from the testimony to the distressed child in the gallery. Emma's tears began to flow more freely now. She didn't understand the legal proceedings. She didn't comprehend that her grandmother was trying to help her stay in their home together. She didn't understand that this man in the suit behind the tall desk, this judge, was making decisions about her future. All she understood was that everything felt scary and overwhelming. The high ceiling seemed to press down on her. The formal language bounced off the marble walls incomprehensibly. The serious faces surrounding her communicated danger, even if they meant her no harm. "I'm sorry," Margaret said softly, looking up at the judge with apologetic eyes. She's scared." Judge Henderson set down her pen, her jaw tightening slightly. She'd presided over numerous family law cases and understood that children often became emotional. But she ran a formal courtroom, one where decorum mattered. She held up her hand slightly, signaling to Sarah to pause her testimony. "We'll take a brief recess," Judge Henderson announced, her voice carrying that particular tone of someone whose patience was wearing thin. 15 minutes. Court will reconvene at 2:15. The bailiff called out the official announcement. Attorneys began gathering their materials. The reporters stepped back from their equipment. Margaret immediately pulled Emma close, whispering urgently, Okay, we're taking a break now, sweetheart. Let's just breathe, okay? In and out, in and out." But even during the recess, Emma couldn't calm down. The legal momentum that had been building continued to press against her even in the break. Margaret walked her granddaughter to a small waiting area outside the courtroom, away from the formal setting, trying to offer comfort in a more private space. She sat on a bench and pulled Emma into her lap, rocking her gently the way she had when Emma was an infant. "Mommy?" Emma asked through her tears, her voice small and confused. "Where's Mommy?" The question broke Margaret's heart. This was the core of Emma's trauma, the fundamental uncertainty that no legal proceeding could address directly. Emma didn't understand why her mother wasn't there. She didn't understand why everything had changed. She didn't understand that the adults were trying to figure out what was best for her. "Mommy loves you so much," Margaret said, her own voice thick with emotion. "And I love you. That's what matters, okay? We love you." But love, as powerful as it was, couldn't quiet Emma's anxious mind. Her breathing remained rapid. Her body remained tense. Margaret tried singing a lullaby. She tried talking about happy memories. She tried distraction techniques she'd learned from Emma's child therapist. Nothing worked. The damage of the past 6 months, the uncertainty, the instability, the trauma of family dissolution, had taken root in Emma's nervous system. She was a 3-year-old carrying adult-sized emotional burdens. A court officer passing by paused, observing Margaret's struggle. Margaret felt the weight of judgment in his gaze. Was she handling this correctly? Was the judge going to perceive this as evidence of her inability to properly care for Emma? The stakes of custody cases extended beyond the courtroom itself. Every moment of the child's behavior could become evidence. Every emotional response could be interpreted as indicating something about the caregiver's competence. As the recess timer ticked away, Margaret continued trying desperately to soothe her granddaughter. Emma's anxiety showed no signs of diminishing. If anything, as the moment to return to court approached, the child's distress seemed to intensify, as though her body understood that she was about to return to the place where everything felt wrong and frightening. Margaret held her granddaughter close, whispered assurances into her blonde curls, and tried to mentally prepare herself for what would happen when they returned to that formal courtroom, where a judge would be watching, evaluating, deciding her granddaughter's entire future based partly on this child's ability to maintain composure in an inherently traumatic situation. The 15 minutes felt both eternal and impossibly short. Margaret's heart ached with the helplessness of someone who loved fiercely, but couldn't fix what was fundamentally broken in a system that asked traumatized children to participate in their own legal proceedings without adequate support or understanding. The bailiff's voice echoed through the courthouse corridors, announcing that court would reconvene in 5 minutes. Margaret gathered Emma into her arms, the child still trembling, still breathing unevenly, still manifesting all the visible signs of acute anxiety. Margaret's stomach twisted with dread as she led her granddaughter back toward the courtroom doors. She'd done everything she could during the recess, but nothing had truly calmed Emma. The child's nervous system remained in crisis mode, her body flooded with stress hormones that no amount of grandmother's love could chemically neutralize. As they re-entered the courtroom, Margaret guided Emma back to their seats in the gallery. Emma climbed back onto the wooden bench, her small body stiff and resistant. Margaret settled beside her, taking her granddaughter's trembling hand once more. Officer Sarah had returned to her seat near the witness stand, and Duke remained in his trained position on the floor beside her, exactly where he'd been before the recess. The dog hadn't moved, hadn't complained, hadn't required anything during the break. He simply waited with the patient resignation of a well-trained working animal, his dark eyes alert but calm, his breathing steady and even. Judge Henderson returned to her elevated bench, settling into her leather chair with an air of judicial authority. She looked down at the courtroom, her gaze briefly touching Emma in the gallery. The judge's expression remained professional and neutral, but there was a hint of something else there, perhaps concern, perhaps impatience, perhaps the weight of understanding that she had to make a decision about this child's future despite the disruptions and emotional complexity of the proceedings. "We're back on the record," Judge Henderson announced, signaling to the court reporter that testimony would resume. "Officer Mitchell, you may continue with your testimony. Counsel, do you have any objections?" Both attorneys indicated they were ready to proceed. Sarah nodded and resumed her careful, detailed description of the incident from 6 months ago. She spoke about what she'd observed, the tone of voice used, the physical behaviors, the statements made, all the specific details that formed the factual foundation of her testimony. Her voice remained professional and measured, the practiced tone of someone accustomed to public speaking and legal proceedings. But as Sarah continued speaking, Emma's condition deteriorated further. The child hadn't actually calmed during the recess. Margaret had simply managed to contain her anxiety temporarily. Now back in the courtroom, back in that formal space with its oppressive atmosphere, Emma's anxiety surged forward with renewed intensity. Her small body began to shake visibly. Her breathing became more audible, a soft panting that suggested genuine panic rather than simple unhappiness. Margaret wrapped her arm around Emma, pulling her granddaughter against her side, trying through physical proximity to communicate safety and protection. But Emma's fear was too large for even her grandmother's embrace to contain. Tears began streaming down the child's small face, flowing freely now without restraint. Her lips trembled. Her chin quivered. A soft crying sound escaped her throat, not loud enough to completely interrupt the proceedings, but present enough to be noticed. Judge Henderson's eyes shifted toward Emma again, this time with visible frustration. The judge didn't tolerate disruptions well. She ran a tight courtroom where order and decorum were maintained. The expression on her face suggested that she was about to call another recess or perhaps reprimand Margaret for not better managing the child's behavior. Sarah also paused in her testimony, uncomfortable with continuing while a child in the courtroom was clearly in distress. But at that precise moment, that exact instant when Judge Henderson was about to speak, when Sarah was about to pause further, when the entire courtroom's attention was focused on Emma's escalating crisis, something extraordinary happened. Something that defied training, protocol, and the careful boundaries that separated working animals from the cases they observed. Duke stood up. The movement was sudden enough to draw immediate attention. Officer Sarah glanced down in shock, her hand instinctively moving toward her K-9 partner, though she didn't physically grab him. In 4 years of working together, Duke had never broken his position without explicit command. The dog was trained extensively to remain calm and composed during courtroom appearances. Breaking protocol without instruction violated everything he'd been trained to do. But Duke's attention wasn't on Sarah. His dark brown eyes were fixed entirely on Emma. His ears perked forward with laser-like focus. His body language shifted from the relaxed alertness of a working dog at rest to something more purposeful, more intentional. It was as though something deep within the animal's consciousness had recognized a need that transcended training, a situation that required him to act based on instinct rather than conditioning. Without waiting for any command, without seeking permission, Duke began walking across the courtroom toward Emma. His movement was deliberate and slow, not rushed or aggressive, but with clear purpose. The entire courtroom fell silent. Attorneys mid-conversation stopped speaking. The court reporter's fingers paused above her keyboard. Even Judge Henderson, who'd been about to speak, stopped mid-thought, watching the dog's progress with visible surprise. Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief. "Duke, sit," she called out, but the dog didn't respond to the command. He continued his trajectory toward Emma, his focus unwavering. The bailiff looked uncertain, glancing toward the judge for direction, but Judge Henderson held up her hand slightly, a gesture that seemed to indicate, "Let's see where this goes." Duke approached Emma slowly and methodically, his body language entirely non-threatening. He didn't jump. He didn't bark. He didn't demand anything. He simply moved with the kind of gentle deliberation that seemed almost choreographed, as though he understood exactly what the terrified child needed. Margaret watched the dog's approach with a mixture of wariness and hope, unsure whether this was appropriate, unsure what would happen next. When Duke reached Emma's chair, he didn't sit immediately. Instead, he paused for just a moment, as though assessing the child's state, reading her emotional temperature. His dark eyes met Emma's tear-filled eyes with an expression of such pure, unconditional compassion that it seemed to transcend species. In that moment, the dog and the child recognized something in each other, perhaps a shared understanding of vulnerability, perhaps a mutual acknowledgement of need. Then, without any hesitation or instruction, Duke sat down directly beside Emma's chair. His large, muscular body pressed gently against the child's small legs. The German shepherd rested his head close to Emma's lap, his warm, dark eyes gazing upward at the 3-year-old with an expression of unwavering attention and acceptance. Duke didn't demand anything. He didn't require petting or interaction. He simply positioned himself beside the child, offering his presence as a kind of anchor to the present moment. The effect was instantaneous and profound. Emma's crying stopped mid-sob, as though someone had suddenly turned off a switch. Her breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, slowed noticeably. Her small hand, trembling just moments before, reached down toward Duke's soft fur with tentative curiosity. She touched his coat gently, her tiny fingers connecting with the warmth of his body. Margaret felt the shift in her granddaughter's emotional state immediately. The rigid tension in Emma's small frame began to dissolve. The panic that had flooded the child's nervous system began to release. Emma's other hand reached down as well, and she gently stroked Duke's head, her movements slow and deliberate. The dog remained perfectly still, offering nothing but steady, consistent presence. The courtroom remained completely silent, everyone witnessing what seemed like an impossible moment of connection between a traumatized child and a police dog, who'd somehow transcended his training to respond to a deeper, more fundamental need. Even Judge Henderson leaned forward slightly, her stern expression softening as she observed the interaction. Whatever legal or procedural concerns might have existed moments before seemed suddenly insignificant in the face of what was unfolding. A moment of genuine healing, of one living being offering comfort to another without words, without agenda, without anything except pure, instinctive compassion. Judge Patricia Henderson had presided over family law cases for 23 years. She'd witnessed countless custody disputes, heard endless testimonies about parental fitness, observed children's behavioral responses to the legal system, and made decisions that altered the trajectories of countless lives. She developed a professional distance, a necessary emotional buffer that allowed her to remain objective and focused on the law rather than being overwhelmed by the human suffering that inevitably accompanied family dissolution. Yet, as she watched the interaction between Duke and Emma unfold before her, that carefully maintained professional distance began to crack. The judge set down her pen slowly, her eyes never leaving the tableau in front of her. She observed with the intensity of someone who'd been trained to notice details, to read situations, to understand the deeper layers beneath surface behaviors. Judge Henderson had studied psychology before law school, had written her thesis on child development and trauma responses, and had spent years applying that knowledge to custody cases. She understood, on both intellectual and intuitive levels, what was happening before her eyes. Emma's entire physical being had transformed. The trembling that had seized her small body just moments before was visibly decreasing. The rapid, shallow breathing that had suggested panic was slowing, becoming more rhythmic and controlled. The tears that had been flowing freely were beginning to dry on the child's cheeks, but more significantly, Emma's facial expression had changed. The fear and confusion that had dominated her features was being replaced by something else, a kind of focused calm, a grounding in the present moment. The judge recognized this transformation from her earlier studies in child psychology. She understood that traumatic stress in young children manifested as a dysregulation of the nervous system. The amygdala, the brain's fear center, essentially hijacked rational thought, flooding the body with cortisol and adrenaline, creating the fight-flight-freeze responses that Emma had been displaying. But something about Duke's presence seemed to activate a different neural pathway in the child. The dog's steady, calm demeanor, his complete lack of judgment, his unwavering attention, these elements appeared to communicate safety to Emma's frightened nervous system in a way that words, logic, or even a grandmother's love could not. Judge Henderson leaned forward slightly in her chair, her keen eyes observing every detail of the interaction. She noticed how Duke's body language remained soft and non-threatening. The dog's muscles were relaxed, his posture open, his breathing steady. He wasn't performing for the courtroom or seeking approval. He was simply being present with the child, offering the kind of unconditional acceptance that most humans struggled to provide to each other, much less to traumatized children. She noticed how Emma's small hands moved across Duke's coat with increasing confidence. The child's touch became less tentative, more exploratory. Emma's fingers found Duke's ears and stroked them gently, and the dog remained perfectly still, allowing the child to find comfort and connection through tactile interaction. It was as though Duke understood, perhaps through some deeper animal intuition, that Emma needed to actively engage with him, to participate in the connection rather than passively receive comfort. Most significantly, Judge Henderson observed Emma's breathing pattern. The child's respiration had synchronized with Duke's breathing. This wasn't coincidental. It was a documented phenomenon in trauma therapy. When a child could synchronize their breathing with another living being, it helped regulate their nervous system, helped reset their physiological state from crisis mode to stability. Duke had somehow, either through training or pure instinct, positioned himself in exactly the way Emma needed to facilitate this synchronization. The judge's mind raced through the psychological principles she'd learned decades earlier. Mirror neurons, the brain's capacity to resonate with another's emotional state. Oxytocin, the bonding hormone released through positive physical touch and connection. Polyvagal theory, the understanding that safety in the nervous system required something beyond intellectual assurance. It required a felt sense of security that came through connection with another being. Duke was providing all of these elements simultaneously, without any conscious understanding of the neurochemistry involved. Judge Henderson glanced toward Margaret, observing the grandmother's reaction. Margaret's face was flooded with relief and gratitude. The older woman's eyes glistened with tears, not of despair, but of hope. Margaret seemed to understand that something transformative had just occurred, that her granddaughter had been rescued from a psychological state that no amount of maternal comfort could have addressed. The judge also noticed Officer Sarah's expression, shock mixed with professional concern. Sarah's hand had moved back to her lap, no longer reaching for Duke. She seemed to comprehend that her partner had acted from something deeper than training, and she was respecting that action, giving the dog space to complete whatever he'd begun. Judge Henderson turned her attention inward for a moment, reflecting on her own response to what she was witnessing. For years, she'd made custody decisions based on factors like parental income, housing stability, employment history, family history, and documented statements about parental capacity. These factors mattered, certainly. They provided the legal and practical framework within which children lived. But what she was observing now suggested something equally important: the emotional and physiological capacity of a child to feel safe, to regulate their nervous system, to trust that the world was a manageable place. Emma had been displaying what seemed like resistance to staying with her grandmother. The judge had been beginning to wonder if Margaret's presence was actually comforting, or if the custody arrangement itself was causing the child distress. But now, watching Emma's transformation, Judge Henderson understood something crucial. Emma's anxiety wasn't a result of being with her grandmother. Emma's anxiety was a result of the trauma itself, of the legal proceedings, of the overwhelming formality and uncertainty of the courtroom environment. The judge found herself making mental notes about what she was observing. She recognized that this moment, this extraordinary connection between a police dog and a traumatized child, might be relevant to her decision, not as a legal argument but as evidence of what Emma actually needed, not just a safe place to live, but an environment that could support her emotional regulation, her sense of safety, her capacity to heal from trauma. Judge Henderson's judicial training demanded that she remain objective, that she not allow emotion to cloud her legal judgment. And yet, her earlier studies in psychology and her years of experience with children demanded that she acknowledge the profound importance of what she was witnessing. These weren't contradictory requirements. They were complementary. The most objective decision would be one that recognized Emma's genuine emotional and psychological needs, not just her material and legal ones. The judge observed as Emma continued stroking Duke's ears, as the child's breathing remained synchronized with the dog's, as the entire courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath, witnessing something that transcended the usual proceedings of the law. She noted the time in her mind, 2:27 p.m. on a Tuesday in March, a moment that would stay with her, that would influence how she approached trauma-affected children in future cases. Judge Henderson found herself thinking about the systemic limitations of the legal system when it came to addressing childhood trauma. The law could determine custody, it could mandate therapy, it could create visitation schedules. But the law couldn't command the kind of genuine healing that seemed to be occurring right before her eyes. Healing required something beyond legal authority. It required connection, presence, acceptance, and the kind of unconditional support that appeared to transcend species and professional boundaries. As she continued to observe, Judge Henderson made a private decision. Whatever else happened in this case, whatever the merits of the competing custody arguments, she would find a way to integrate recognition of this moment into her judgment. She would acknowledge that Emma possessed the capacity to heal, that the child could find stability and safety, and that sometimes the most powerful interventions in a child's recovery came from sources that couldn't be predicted or controlled by any legal framework. The judge's stern expression had softened considerably, her usual judicial mask slipping to reveal something more human beneath, a recognition of the profound mystery of healing, the power of connection, and the limitations of any system that tried to reduce the complexity of human trauma to legal categories and procedural requirements. Judge Henderson called for another recess, this time with a notably different tone than before. There was no irritation in her voice, no impatience. Instead, her announcement carried a quality of thoughtful intention, as though she recognized that this moment required pause and reflection rather than procedural efficiency. The bailiff made the official announcement, and the courtroom began to shift into break mode. Attorneys gathered their materials, the court reporter stepped back from her equipment, and spectators began moving toward the hallway. Officer Sarah remained in her seat, observing Duke with a mixture of amazement and concern. The dog had finally settled into a calmer state beside Emma, his head still resting near the child's lap, his body language communicating complete contentment with his position. Sarah had never seen Duke behave this way before, and her mind raced with questions. Had she somehow failed to understand her partner's full capabilities? Was there something about Emma's distress that had triggered an instinctive response that transcended even 4 years of training together? Margaret sat frozen for a moment, as though afraid that any sudden movement might disrupt the fragile peace that had settled over her granddaughter. Emma continued to gently stroke Duke's coat, her small fingers moving in slow, repetitive patterns that seemed to calm not just the child but the dog as well. The grandmother's eyes were shining with unshed tears, tears of relief, of gratitude, of hope that perhaps, finally, there might be a way to help her granddaughter navigate this traumatic situation. As the courtroom began to clear, Margaret slowly stood, careful not to pull Emma away from Duke. She guided her granddaughter's hand gently, whispering, "Come on, sweetie. We're going to take another break. Duke will be right here, okay?" Emma's eyes widened slightly in concern at the suggestion of separation, but Margaret continued speaking softly. "Officer Sarah and Duke will wait for us. We'll come right back. But first, let's get some water and take a few minutes to breathe, okay?" With obvious reluctance, Emma removed her hands from Duke's coat. The dog remained perfectly still, his eyes following the child as Margaret led her toward the courtroom exit. Margaret glanced back at Officer Sarah with an expression of profound gratitude, mouthing "thank you" without words. Sarah nodded, her own expression conveying understanding and a kind of shared awe at what had just transpired. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Margaret guided Emma to a small waiting area with some basic furniture and a water fountain. She helped her granddaughter drink from a paper cup, the cool water seeming to provide some additional grounding. Emma's breathing had remained stable, Her anxiety notably decreased from what it had been before Duke's intervention. "Grandma," Emma asked, her small voice still tentative, "where's Duke?" "Duke is in the courtroom, sweetheart," Margaret replied, sitting down on a bench and pulling Emma into her lap. "With Officer Sarah. He's waiting for us." "Can Duke stay with me?" Emma asked, the question revealing the depth of the connection that had formed so rapidly and completely. Margaret's heart ached at the simplicity and profundity of her granddaughter's request. I think Duke helped you so much that maybe we can ask Officer Sarah if that's possible, okay? But let me talk to some people first." As Margaret sat with Emma, cradling her granddaughter close, she noticed that the court-appointed child psychologist, Dr. James Chen, had stepped out of the courtroom and was now approaching her in the hallway. Dr. Chen was a compassionate professional who'd been observing the proceedings, tasked with providing an independent assessment of Emma's emotional state and needs. His face bore an expression of genuine astonishment. "That was remarkable," Dr. Chen said, sitting down on the bench beside Margaret and Emma. "In my 15 years of working with traumatized children, I've never seen a response quite like that." Margaret nodded, still processing the magnitude of what had occurred. "I don't know what just happened," she admitted, "but it's like he knew exactly what she needed." Dr. Chen leaned forward slightly, his professional demeanor softened by genuine compassion. "Can I ask you some questions about Emma's background, specifically about her relationship with animals?" Margaret spent the next several minutes describing Emma's history. She explained that before her parents' separation, Emma and her father had spent weekends at her grandfather's farm in the foothills outside Denver. The farm had several dogs, and Emma had been drawn to them from infancy. There was something about the animals that had always calmed her, that had brought out a different side of her personality, less anxious, more present, more capable of genuine joy. "After the separation," Margaret continued, her voice thick with emotion, "Emma stopped going to the farm. Her father's custody time has been limited, and there's been so much conflict and instability. I think Emma lost access not just to her father but to that environment, those animals, that sense of safety she had there." Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully, making mental notes. "That's significant," he said. "It's possible that Emma's nervous system developed an association between animals and safety, particularly dogs. The farm environment represented stability and unconditional acceptance. When that was removed, along with everything else that was destabilizing about the family separation, Emma essentially lost one of her primary coping mechanisms." "What does that mean?" Margaret asked, hope flickering in her chest. "What should we do about it?" "It means," Dr. Chen said carefully, "that animal-assisted therapy might be genuinely beneficial for Emma, not as a substitute for traditional therapy, but as a complementary intervention. Animals can regulate a child's nervous system in ways that words and reasoning cannot. They offer presence without judgment, connection without complexity." Officer Sarah appeared in the hallway, having stepped out of the courtroom to check on Emma and Margaret. She looked from Margaret to Dr. Chen with a questioning expression. "Officer Mitchell," Margaret said, standing and approaching Sarah with tears streaming down her face. "I don't know how to thank you. What Duke did in there, it changed something. It helped Emma in a way nothing else has been able to." Sarah, still somewhat bewildered by Duke's behavior, found herself moved by Margaret's gratitude. "I've never seen him do anything like that," Sarah admitted. "In all our time working together, he's never broken protocol, but something about Emma. He just knew she needed help." Dr. Chen extended his hand to Sarah. "I'm Dr. James Chen, the child psychologist assigned to this case. What we witnessed in there was extraordinary. It appears that your K-9 partner somehow intuitively recognized Emma's trauma response and provided exactly the kind of grounding and nervous system regulation that this child desperately needs." Sarah shook his hand, still processing everything. "Is Emma okay now?" she asked, her concern genuine. "She's significantly calmer than she was," Dr. Chen replied. Her nervous system appears to have responded positively to Duke's presence. The question now is whether we can somehow maintain or replicate that benefit for her going forward. Margaret looked at Sarah with vulnerable hope in her eyes. Would it be possible? I know this is unusual, but would it be possible for Duke to remain in the courtroom with Emma for the rest of the proceedings? I know it's not standard, but it helped her so much. Sarah glanced back toward the courtroom, then at Margaret and Emma. That would be up to the judge, she said thoughtfully. But I think after what just happened, Judge Henderson might be open to it. Let me go back in and feel out the situation. As Sarah returned to the courtroom, Margaret held Emma close, whispering reassurances about Duke, about safety, about the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was a path forward that included the healing presence of a dog who seemed to understand, on some profound level, what a traumatized child needed to feel safe enough to begin healing. Dr. Chen remained in the hallway, mentally reorganizing his assessment of this case. What had started as a standard custody evaluation had just become something far more significant, a demonstration of the power of animal-assisted intervention, a reminder that trauma healing sometimes came from unexpected sources, and evidence that the most effective interventions were sometimes the ones that transcended professional boundaries and reached directly into the neurobiological needs of a suffering child. When court reconvened at 2:45 p.m., the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted noticeably. Judge Henderson had spent her recess time reflecting on what she'd witnessed, consulting briefly with her clerk about precedent and procedure, and making a decision that would mark a departure from standard courtroom protocol. As the bailiff called the court back to order, the judge's expression carried a quality of purposeful determination, as though she'd arrived at a conclusion that superseded conventional procedures. Officer Sarah re-entered with Duke at her side, the dog walking in his usual composed manner, unaware of the extraordinary significance he'd acquired in the past half hour. Margaret and Emma followed, Emma's small hand gripping her grandmother's as they made their way back to their seats in the gallery. Emma's eyes immediately searched for Duke, and when she spotted the German Shepherd, visible relief flooded her features. The child's shoulders relaxed slightly, her breathing steadied, and she seemed to settle into anticipation rather than anxiety about what would come next. Judge Henderson surveyed the courtroom, her gaze moving from the attorneys to the witnesses to the gallery where Emma sat watching Duke. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of judicial authority tempered with something more human, recognition of a situation that transcended the usual legal frameworks. Before we continue with testimony, Judge Henderson announced, I need to address something that occurred in this courtroom during the previous session. Officer Mitchell, please approach the bench. Sarah guided Duke forward, approaching the judge's elevated position with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. She had no idea what the judge intended to say or ask. Officer Mitchell, Judge Henderson began, in your professional assessment, is your K-9 partner Duke trained to provide therapy or comfort to individuals outside his official police duties? Sarah considered the question carefully. Not formally, Your Honor. Duke is trained for investigation assistance and evidence detection. However, dogs are naturally intuitive about emotional states, and I've observed that his calm presence can be reassuring to people who are anxious or stressed. Judge Henderson nodded thoughtfully. What you just described, combined with what I observed during the last session, suggests that your partner possesses both training and natural instinct that could be beneficial to this child's participation in these proceedings. I am therefore making an unprecedented ruling. I am permitting K-9 Duke to remain in the courtroom, positioned beside the minor, Emma Richardson, for the duration of these proceedings. This decision is based on my observation that the child's emotional state and capacity to remain present improved dramatically following the animal's proximity and interaction. A murmur of surprise rippled through the courtroom. The attorneys exchanged glances, some surprised, some thoughtful. The court reporter made careful notes, documenting this unusual ruling for the record. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears of gratitude. Judge Henderson continued, her tone formal but not unkind. I want to be clear that this ruling is based solely on the child's welfare and her capacity to participate meaningfully in these proceedings. The presence of the animal appears to have a documented positive effect on her emotional regulation and her ability to remain present. While this is unconventional, the best interests of the child supersede standard courtroom procedure. Officer Sarah felt a surge of pride in Duke, understanding that her partner had somehow transcended his training to respond to a genuine need. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said simply. "You may return to your seat," Judge Henderson directed. "And Officer Mitchell, I'd appreciate it if you would position Duke directly beside the minor rather than in your usual location. We want to maximize the stabilizing effect you've already observed." As Sarah guided Duke toward Emma, the child's face lit up with joy, a genuine smile replacing the anxiety that had dominated her expression for weeks. Margaret helped position Duke so that the dog sat directly beside Emma's chair, his body close enough for the child to touch, but not so close as to obstruct anyone's view of the proceedings. Emma immediately placed her small hand on Duke's back, and the dog settled into position with perfect calm, as though he'd been stationed there all along. Judge Henderson waited until Emma was fully settled before continuing. "Now then," she said, looking toward Officer Sarah, "you may resume your testimony, Officer Mitchell. Please describe the specific incident from 6 months ago that brought you to this case." Sarah took the witness stand again, and this time, as she spoke, Emma remained peaceful. The child's attention drifted between listening to the proceedings and gently stroking Duke's coat. The dog's presence provided a steady anchor, allowing Emma's nervous system to remain regulated even as adults spoke about difficult family situations and concerning behaviors. Sarah described the domestic call she'd responded to 6 months prior. She detailed the tension she'd observed between the parents, the raised voices, the concerning physical aggression she'd witnessed. She described Emma's presence during the incident and how the child had appeared frightened and confused. Her testimony was thorough, professional, and clearly impactful, the kind of evidence that could significantly influence the judge's custody determination. But what struck everyone in the courtroom was that Emma remained calm throughout. The child heard her own experience being described in formal legal language, heard her parents' behavior being cataloged and analyzed, but she did so while connected to Duke's steady presence. The dog served as a kind of psychological buffer, absorbing the anxiety that might otherwise have overwhelmed the child hearing these painful truths about her family. When the opposing counsel began their cross-examination, attempting to challenge some details of Sarah's observations, Emma's slight tension returned. But Duke, seemingly aware of the shift in the courtroom's emotional tenor, pressed his body more firmly against the child's legs, as though offering additional support. Emma's breathing deepened, her hand gripped Duke's fur more tightly, and she remained grounded in the present moment rather than retreating into anxiety. Judge Henderson observed this dynamic carefully, making additional notes in the court file. The judge was documenting not just the testimony but the entire context, how Emma was able to participate, how the child's capacity for presence and regulation improved with Duke's presence, how the courtroom environment became more manageable when the traumatized child had access to an animal's grounding support. Other witnesses were called throughout the afternoon. Emma's father testified, attempting to present himself as a stable, involved parent despite his limited custody record. His attorney questioned Sarah's observations, suggesting that her interpretation of the incident 6 months prior was biased or incomplete. But throughout all of this, Emma remained settled beside Duke, her small hand maintaining contact with the dog's coat, drawing strength and stability from that connection. As the afternoon progressed, Judge Henderson found herself becoming increasingly convinced that whatever decision she made about custody, she would need to address Emma's emotional and psychological needs explicitly. The child clearly required support beyond standard child welfare provisions. The animal-assisted intervention that was occurring in real time in her courtroom suggested a powerful therapeutic avenue that shouldn't be ignored. When one of the attorneys made a particularly sharp comment about Margaret's parenting capability, Emma's eyes widened in fear, and she looked up at her grandmother with uncertainty. Duke immediately turned his head slightly, pressing it against Emma's arm, refocusing the child's attention on the present moment and away from the threatening language. The dog's intervention was so perfectly timed, so instinctively responsive, that Judge Henderson found herself genuinely moved. At one point, Emma whispered something to Duke, inaudible to everyone else but clearly a question or comment meant for the dog. Duke's tail wagged slightly, as though he understood her perfectly. The judge made a note about this interaction, recognizing that Emma had found in this animal a source of unconditional acceptance that was absent in the chaotic legal system surrounding her. By the end of the afternoon session, Judge Henderson had arrived at a crucial realization. The outcome of this custody case would ultimately depend not just on which parent or guardian was technically best, but on which arrangement would provide Emma with access to the kind of emotional support and nervous system regulation that the child clearly required. And if that meant incorporating animal-assisted therapy into her custody order, then that's exactly what she would do. As court adjourned for the day, Emma clung to Duke, and the dog remained perfectly patient, perfectly present, understanding on some fundamental level that this small child needed him in a way that transcended professional boundaries and touched something deeply, essentially human about the nature of healing and connection. The final day of the custody hearing arrived on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the extraordinary events that had transformed the courtroom proceedings. Judge Henderson had taken the intervening time to thoroughly review all testimony, consult with court-appointed experts, research animal-assisted therapy protocols, and carefully consider the complex web of factors that would determine Emma's future. The judge's chambers had been filled with legal briefs, psychological evaluations, and documentation of family history, the exhaustive record upon which custody determinations rested. Emma entered the courtroom for the final session with noticeably less anxiety than she displayed during earlier proceedings. This was partly attributable to Margaret's continued reassurance, but more significantly, it resulted from Emma's knowledge that Duke would be present. The child had spent the intervening weeks in a state of relative stability, attending therapy sessions with Dr. Chen, where animal-assisted interventions were being incorporated, and maintaining her regular schedule with her grandmother. The nightmare frequency had decreased, her appetite had improved, the behavioral indicators of acute trauma had begun to show signs of resolution. Officer Sarah brought Duke to the courtroom once more, and the dog took his now familiar position beside Emma without hesitation. The child greeted the dog with genuine joy, wrapping her small arms around his neck in a hug that Duke tolerated with patient affection. Judge Henderson observed this interaction from the bench, her expression thoughtful and measured, as though she was absorbing every detail for final consideration before delivering her ruling. The courtroom filled with the usual participants, the attorneys for both parents, Margaret and Emma in the gallery, Emma's father and his counsel on the other side of the room, the court reporter prepared to document every word, the bailiff maintaining courtroom decorum. But the atmosphere was notably different from the initial proceedings. There was a sense of anticipation, a recognition that this day would bring closure and determination to a process that had been painful and uncertain for everyone involved, most of all for Emma. Judge Henderson took her seat at the elevated bench and surveyed the courtroom with the gravity of someone about to deliver a judgment that would shape the next several years of a child's life. She began by addressing the court formally, establishing the record and the legal framework within which she'd made her decision. This case involves a custody determination for Emma Richardson, age 3, concerning the parental fitness and best interests of the child in question, Judge Henderson began, her voice carrying the formal cadence of judicial pronouncement. I have reviewed extensive testimony, expert evaluations, and documentary evidence. I have observed the child's behavioral responses throughout these proceedings. I am now prepared to deliver my ruling." The courtroom became absolutely silent. Even Emma seemed to sense the significance of the moment, her hand gripping Duke's fur more tightly, as though the dog might somehow protect her from whatever came next. The testimony presented by Officer Sarah Mitchell was credible and detailed. Judge Henderson continued. Her account of the domestic incident from 6 months prior was consistent, specific, and professionally articulated. The incident in question revealed concerning patterns of conflict and physical aggression that I cannot ignore when evaluating the capacity of either parent to provide a safe, stable environment for a 3-year-old child. The judge paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. Emma's father's attorney began to object, but Judge Henderson held up her hand slightly, silencing him. The court-appointed child psychologist, Dr. James Chen, provided evaluation indicating that the minor has experienced significant trauma associated with family dissolution and parental conflict. The child demonstrated measurable anxiety responses when separated from her primary caregiver, Margaret Richardson, and displayed behavioral indicators consistent with acute stress disorder. Judge Henderson glanced toward Margaret, who sat with tears already streaming down her face, though whether from hope or fear remained unclear. However, the judge continued, the court also observed something remarkable during these proceedings. The child demonstrated a capacity for emotional regulation and presence when provided with appropriate support and connection. Specifically, the child's anxiety responses diminished dramatically in the presence of K9 Duke, a police dog who, through apparent instinctive recognition of the child's distress, provided calming and grounding support. The judge's gaze moved to Officer Sarah and Duke, acknowledging the extraordinary nature of what had transpired. This observation led me to consult with additional experts in animal-assisted therapy and trauma recovery. Those consultations confirmed that animals can provide neurobiological support to traumatized children through mechanisms including nervous system regulation, oxytocin release through physical contact, and provision of unconditional, non-judgmental presence. The minor's responsiveness to this support indicates that animal-assisted intervention could be a valuable component of her therapeutic recovery. Judge Henderson adjusted her glasses, reviewing her written opinion before continuing. Therefore, the court makes the following determination. Custody of Emma Richardson is awarded to her grandmother, Margaret Richardson, with whom the child has been residing and who has demonstrated consistent, loving care and commitment to the child's welfare. This arrangement provides the child with stability, continuity of care, and a secure attachment figure, all of which are essential to the child's psychological recovery and well-being. Margaret's shoulders sagged with relief, and she began openly weeping, tears of gratitude and vindication flowing freely. The child's father, James Richardson, is granted supervised visitation on alternating weekends, with the provision that he complete court-ordered parenting classes focused on conflict resolution, emotional regulation, and child-centered parenting approaches before any unsupervised visitation occurs. Unsupervised visitation may be considered after successful completion of these courses and demonstration of sustained behavioral change. The judge paused, allowing the primary custody determination to be fully absorbed before continuing with what would prove to be the most significant and unusual aspect of her ruling. Additionally, Judge Henderson announced, the court is including specific provisions in this custody order related to the child's emotional and psychological support. Emma Richardson is hereby referred to a formal animal-assisted therapy program specifically designed for trauma-affected children. The child is to participate in weekly sessions with a licensed therapist and a certified therapy animal. The courtroom stirred with murmurs of surprise. A custody order that explicitly mandated animal therapy was virtually unprecedented. Furthermore, Judge Henderson continued, her voice firm and authoritative, the court strongly recommends that Margaret Richardson consider adopting or fostering a dog to provide ongoing animal-assisted support in the child's home environment. Research supports the therapeutic benefit of regular animal contact for children recovering from trauma. The presence of a companion animal can provide consistent, daily support that complements formal therapy sessions. Judge Henderson leaned forward slightly, her expression serious and intent. I want to be absolutely clear for the record, the judge stated, that this custody determination is based on several factors. Margaret Richardson's demonstrated commitment to the child's welfare, the stability of the home environment she provides, the child's clear attachment to her grandmother, and the evidence that the child requires specific therapeutic support to process and recover from the trauma she has experienced. The inclusion of animal-assisted therapy is not a supplementary nice-to-have. It is a necessary component of addressing this child's documented psychological needs. The judge's eyes moved to Officer Sarah and Duke, and her expression softened slightly. I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the extraordinary role played by K-9 Duke in bringing attention to the therapeutic potential of animal-assisted intervention for this child. While this dog was not present in these proceedings by design or planning, his instinctive response to a child's distress demonstrated principles that I believe should inform how we approach trauma-affected children in legal proceedings generally. Judge Henderson adjusted her tone, becoming more reflective and less formally judicial. In my 23 years on the bench, I have made numerous custody determinations. Some have been straightforward, others have been agonizing in their complexity. But I can state with certainty that the recovery and well-being of a child depends not just on material factors like housing and income, but on the child's capacity to feel safe, to regulate their nervous system, and to experience genuine connection and acceptance. This child has demonstrated remarkable responsiveness to connection with an animal. That responsiveness is not incidental, it is central to her healing. Judge Henderson returned to her formal judicial tone for the final pronouncements. Therefore, it is the order of this court that custody of Emma Richardson be granted to Margaret Richardson, with the provisions and recommendations outlined in this ruling. A detailed written opinion will follow within 10 business days. This custody arrangement will be subject to review in 12 months, at which time the court will assess the child's progress in therapy and adjustment to the custody arrangement. All parties are directed to comply fully with the court's orders regarding therapy participation and parenting classes. Court is adjourned. The bailiff made the official announcement, but the courtroom remained relatively quiet, processing the magnitude of what had just transpired. Margaret immediately moved toward Emma, gathering her granddaughter into her arms, weeping with relief and joy. Emma, sensing that something positive had occurred, looked up at her grandmother with tentative hope. "We get to stay together, sweetie," Margaret whispered, "and we're going to get Duke Jr., remember, your very own Duke." Emma's face transformed into genuine joy, the first time in months that her smile reflected true happiness rather than learned behavior or desperate hope. She looked toward Duke and Officer Sarah, her small voice calling out, "Thank you, Duke." Officer Sarah felt her own eyes filling with tears, understanding that her partner had somehow transcended his role as a police dog to become an instrument of healing and transformation in a child's life. Duke, as though understanding the significance of the moment, walked over to Emma one final time, rested his head against the child's body, and remained still as Margaret wrapped her arms around both her granddaughter and the dog who had changed everything. 6 months had passed since Judge Patricia Henderson delivered her unprecedented custody ruling. Officer Sarah Mitchell stood in the lobby of the Denver Police Department headquarters, holding a thick manila envelope addressed to her. Her heart quickened as she recognized the handwriting on the envelope, Margaret Richardson's careful script. Sarah had been anticipating this correspondence, hopping for news about Emma's progress, wondering how the child had adapted to the legal conclusion of her custody case and the beginning of her formal recovery journey. Inside the envelope were several photographs, each one telling a story of transformation and healing. The first image showed Emma sitting in a sunny backyard, her small body leaning against a medium-sized mixed-breed dog with golden brown coloring and gentle eyes. The dog, clearly a rescue animal, wore a collar with tags that jingled visibly in the photograph. Emma's arm was draped across the dog's back, and her smile was radiant, the kind of genuine, unreserved joy that 3-year-olds expressed when they were truly happy and safe. Another photograph showed Emma at what appeared to be her 4th birthday party, surrounded by other children, her grandmother Margaret beaming in the background. Emma wore a pink dress with a tiara, and her expression conveyed confidence and contentment rather than the anxiety that had characterized her during the custody proceedings. The photograph's most striking feature was that Emma's rescue dog, Duke Jr., as the family had named him, sat calmly at the edge of the party, watching the celebration with patient affection. A third photograph captured Emma in what appeared to be a therapy office. The child sat beside a woman Sarah assumed was a licensed therapist, and with them was a large golden retriever wearing a blue vest that identified it as a certified therapy animal. Emma was laughing, her small hand extended toward the dog's face, the therapeutic relationship clearly well established and deeply beneficial. But the most powerful image was the final photograph, Emma standing with her grandmother and Officer Sarah herself, with Duke positioned between them. Sarah's memory jumped back to when this picture must have been taken, at the Denver Police Department's K-9 unit open house, an event Margaret and Emma had attended specifically to thank Officer Sarah and Duke for their role in changing Emma's life. Sarah remembered Emma running toward Duke with complete joy, and without any of the anxiety or fear she displayed during the courtroom proceedings. She remembered the child wrapping her arms around the police dog's neck, while Duke's tail wagged with genuine pleasure at seeing the little girl again. Sarah unfolded the letter that accompanied the photographs, her eyes beginning to scan Margaret's handwritten words. "Dear Officer Sarah and Duke," the letter began, "I hope this reaches you well. I wanted to take time to update you on how wonderfully Emma is doing. The past 6 months have been transformative for our family, and so much of that transformation can be traced directly back to what happened in Judge Henderson's courtroom that day when Duke sat beside my frightened granddaughter." Sarah settled into a chair in the break room, giving herself time to fully read Margaret's detailed account of Emma's progress. "Emma has been attending animal-assisted therapy with Dr. Chen every week," Margaret wrote. "At first, I wasn't entirely sure how much the therapy itself was helping versus simply having a dog present in the room. But Dr. Chen explained to me the neurobiological mechanisms at work, how the dog's presence helps regulate Emma's nervous system, how the physical contact releases calming chemicals in her brain, how the unconditional acceptance the animal offers helps Emma feel safe in ways that words alone cannot accomplish." Sarah smiled as she read, understanding exactly what Margaret meant. She'd been studying animal-assisted therapy herself since the custody case, curious about the mechanisms behind Duke's extraordinary instinctive response to Emma's distress. "The nightmares have stopped," Margaret continued. "Emma used to wake up screaming 2 or 3 times per night. Now she sleeps through almost every night. When she does have a bad dream, having Duke Jr. beside her in bed helps her calm down quickly. We adopted Duke Jr. from a local shelter about 4 months ago. He's a 5-year-old mixed breed that nobody wanted because he was supposedly too shy and anxious himself, but he and Emma bonded immediately. It's as though they recognize something in each other, 2 traumatized beings finding healing through connection with one another." Sarah felt tears beginning to form as she continued reading, moved by the testament to healing and recovery. Emma no longer displays the anxiety symptoms that characterized her during the custody proceedings, Margaret wrote. She's thriving in preschool. She's made friends. She laughs easily and plays with the kind of unself-conscious joy that I wasn't sure I'd ever see in her again. Her therapist, Dr. Chen, recently told me that based on standard trauma recovery assessments, Emma is progressing at a rate that exceeds what would normally be expected for a child with her history of trauma. He attributed much of that progress to the animal-assisted interventions, combined with the stable, loving home environment she now has. Sarah paused in her reading, reflecting on how profoundly different things had turned out for Emma compared to what might have happened without Judge Henderson's willingness to embrace an unconventional intervention. I also wanted to tell you something that occurred after the custody ruling, Margaret continued. Judge Henderson reached out to me personally. She wanted to know more about how the animal-assisted therapy was progressing, because she's become passionate about implementing similar protocols in other cases involving traumatized children. She's been consulting with Dr. Chen about best practices, and she's begun recommending animal-assisted therapy in other custody cases where children display trauma symptoms similar to Emma's. Sarah felt a surge of pride reading this, understanding that Emma's case had rippled outward in ways that would benefit other traumatized children navigating the legal system. Most significantly, Margaret's letter stated, Judge Henderson has partnered with the Denver Police Department to develop a formal program called Canine Companions for Court, which would place certified therapy dogs in child advocacy centers and courtrooms to support traumatized children during legal proceedings. She told me that your Duke inspired this idea. The program is still in early development stages, but the vision is to have trained K-9 teams available to provide support to children who are struggling emotionally during custody determinations and other family law proceedings. Sarah's breath caught slightly as she absorbed the magnitude of what was being described. Duke had inspired a program that could help countless children navigating the family court system. I wanted you to know, Margaret continued, that Emma talks about her Duke constantly, not in a way that suggests she's stuck in the past or unable to move forward, but in a way that reflects genuine gratitude and affection. She's asked if you might be able to visit our home sometime so she can introduce Duke Jr. to you and Duke in person. Of course, I understand if that's not possible given your professional responsibilities, but the invitation stands. The letter was signed with Margaret's warm regards and a request for Officer Sarah to stay in touch and share updates about Duke's well-being and career. Sarah folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, her mind racing with thoughts about everything that had transpired. She walked from the break room directly to the K-9 unit facilities, where Duke was resting in his climate-controlled kennel. The dog lifted his head immediately upon seeing Sarah, his tail beginning to wag with recognition and affection. "Hey, buddy," Sarah said, approaching Duke and running her hand along his familiar coat. "You have no idea what you did, do you? You changed a little girl's life. And not just her, you've inspired a whole program that's going to help other children." Duke pressed his head against Sarah's leg, his tail wagging more enthusiastically, as though he understood at least the emotional content of her words, even if the specific details remained beyond his comprehension. That afternoon, Officer Sarah scheduled a meeting with her commanding officer and requested the opportunity to work with Judge Henderson and Dr. Chen on developing the Canine Companions for Court program. She envisioned a structured protocol for selecting and training K-9 officers whose dogs possessed not just the technical skills, but the instinctive empathy that Duke had demonstrated. She imagined the program expanding beyond Denver to other jurisdictions, creating a network of therapy dogs available to traumatized children in family law proceedings across the country. Within weeks, the concept began taking shape. Judge Henderson officially announced the program at a press conference attended by local media, child advocacy organizations, and law enforcement officials. She spoke eloquently about Emma's case, about the transformative power of animal-assisted intervention, and about the necessity of reimagining how the legal system supported traumatized children. The Denver Police Department's Public Information Office released a statement highlighting Duke's exceptional service and instinctive compassion. The story captured local media attention and eventually expanded to regional and national news outlets. Duke became something of a celebrity within law enforcement circles and among animal welfare advocates. He received official recognition from the department, an award ceremony where Emma and Margaret attended, with Emma presenting Duke with a special badge of honor that she decorated herself with glitter and heart stickers. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was the impact on the countless other children who would benefit from similar interventions as the Canine Companions for Court program expanded and professionalized. In courtrooms across Denver, and eventually across the country, traumatized children would find themselves supported by trained therapy dogs during their most vulnerable legal proceedings. Families would be reunited or reorganized with the knowledge that children could heal not just from legal outcomes, but from the neurobiological support that animals provided. 1 year after the custody ruling, Judge Henderson authored a law review article titled Beyond Legal Precedent, Integrating Neurobiology and Animal-Assisted Therapy in Family Court. The article cited Emma's case as a foundational example of how legal systems could evolve to meet the true psychological and neurobiological needs of traumatized children. The article was widely read in legal and psychological circles, sparking conversations about how courts could become places not just of determination, but of healing. Officer Sarah received a promotion and was assigned to lead the newly developed K-9 therapy unit. She worked with veterinarians, psychologists, and other law enforcement agencies to establish training protocols, certification standards, and ethical guidelines for using police dogs in therapeutic contexts within courtrooms and child advocacy centers. Emma Richardson, now 4 years old and thriving in preschool, continued her weekly animal-assisted therapy sessions with Dr. Chen. She slept through the night, played with other children without anxiety, and spoke about her experiences with age-appropriate understanding and resilience. The trauma she'd experienced remained part of her history, but it no longer defined her present or constrained her future. And Duke, Officer Sarah's extraordinary German Shepherd partner, continued his work, not just as a police dog solving crimes and serving his department, but as an ambassador for a new understanding of how humans and animals could work together to heal the deepest wounds that the family court system inflicted on vulnerable children. His instinctive response to Emma's distress that day in Judge Henderson's courtroom had been captured on court recordings, had been documented in legal opinions, had been cited in psychological literature, and had ultimately changed how an entire judicial system approached the care and support of traumatized children. What had begun as an ordinary courtroom day, an officer and her K-9 partner attending testimony in a routine custody case, had rippled outward to transform policy, to inspire programs, and to offer hope to countless children who would never know the specific story of Emma and Duke, but who would benefit from the legacy of healing that their extraordinary connection had created. The end.